Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy is notable for its radical pessimism and its metaphysics of the will, which profoundly influenced later thinkers such as Nietzsche and Freud. However, like all philosophy, it is not without its criticisms and points that can be considered flaws or limitations. Here are the main aspects that are often pointed out as problematic in Schopenhauer's philosophy. The worst possible life. Schopenhauer argues that existence is intrinsically suffering, because the will, the thing in itself that drives everything, is a blind, irrational, and insatiable drive. Life in this sense oscillates between desire and boredom. For many, this view is too bleak and can lead to passivity or nihilism. Grounds for compassion. Although Schopenhauer proposes compassion as the basis of morality, identifying with the suffering of others as if it were one's own, some critics, such as Nietzsche, question the solidity of this foundation in a universe governed by a blind and selfish will. Compassion seems to be a rare exception, rather than a universal path to overcoming suffering. Escape from the will as an ideal. The solutions he proposes for suffering, aesthetic contemplation, asceticism, denial of the will to life, are seen by many as elitist, impractical for most people, or as a denial of life itself rather than a constructive affirmation. Vagueness and difficulty of testing. The concept of will as the thing in itself, an irrational metaphysical force that underlies all reality, is inherently speculative and difficult to understand or verify empirically. Although he tries to prove it through introspection into the body, the nature of the will remains a mysterious and unclear concept for modern science. Anthropomorphism of the will. Some critics argue that Schopenhauer's will, although supposedly blind and unconscious, ends up acquiring almost human characteristics, such as wanting, desiring, suffering, which can be seen as anthropomorphism applied to metaphysics. Determinism versus freedom. Schopenhauer advocated a strict determinism of individual character, which makes freedom of action illusory. If the will is the primordial force that drives us and character is immutable, what is the room for moral responsibility or genuine change? This has generated debates and difficulties in his ethics. Role of the intellect. Schopenhauer saw the intellect as a servant of the will, subservient to its impulses. However, he also believed that the intellect, in its capacity for aesthetic contemplation and knowledge of the Platonic ideas, could temporarily free us from the will. This duality raises questions about the coherence of the role of the intellect in his philosophy. If the intellect is merely an instrument of the will, how can it oppose it and offer liberation? Denial of will and life. The radical denial of will as a path to liberation from suffering can be seen as a denial of life itself. This raises the question of whether a philosophy that leads to such a denial is truly functional for human existence. Misogynistic views. Schopenhauer is notoriously misogynistic in his writings, especially in his essay On Women. He describes women in disparaging terms, considering them intellectually inferior, less rational, and more prone to vanity and frivolity. These views are widely rejected and considered a stain on his philosophy, not only because they are morally offensive, but also because they demonstrate a prejudice that may have biased his analyses of human nature. Racial and social prejudices. Although less prominent, there are also hints of social and racial prejudices in his work, reflecting the attitudes of his time but which do not hold up in the light of contemporary knowledge and values. Lack of a positive project. Unlike other philosophers who, while acknowledging suffering, propose a path to building a meaningful life, such as Nietzsche, with his affirmation of life, or the existentialists, with the creation of values, Schopenhauer offers a way out that is ultimately a retreat or an escape from existence. For many, this is not a complete or inspiring solution to life's challenges. Despite these criticisms, it is essential to recognize the impact and originality of Schopenhauer's philosophy. He was one of the first Western thinkers to highlight the irrationality and suffering inherent in existence, paving the way for depth psychology and existentialism. His ideas about the will as a metaphysical force and the importance of art and Compassion continue to be the subject of study and debate in philosophy. However, the flaws generally focus on his pessimistic rigidity, the speculative nature of his metaphysics, and the personal biases that permeate some of his analyses.
The Virtual Books publishing team thanks for your visit. If you liked our channel, please subscribe and share.